Alright, today we're going to show you part 1 of my Paul Reed Smith restore. We're going to start by pulling off all the hardware and getting the body clean, ready to pull off the finish, which was an incredibly painful task. I did a Les Paul restore many years ago. That was probably one of my better videos, and I decided to take on a Paul Reed Smith project, and that was just not a good idea. So we'll start by removing all the hardware, screw all this stuff off, pull out the springs, pull out the pickups, get the body clean. This guitar is actually pretty beat up, which is why I decided to restore it. There were a bunch of chips and chunks out of the body. I had used the super glue to fix a couple of spots, but it just didn't look right, so I wanted to do the full restore. The fretboard was worn down pretty good on the sides, and the frets were in terrible condition. As I used my soldering iron to heat up the fret, I got a bunch of chips and chunks pulled out as well, so I used some super glue to re-glue those down. But I'll go through and pull off all the frets, just heating it up and slowly pulling it out with some flat end nippers. And then here's where a lot of disappointment starts with this guitar body. Really disappointed in the way Paul Reed Smith finishes these guitars. What you can see here is I'm pulling off the 2K with the heat gun, but then there is I guess like an epoxy sealer or some sort of cement-based sealer that soaks into the wood about a 1/16, and it is nearly impossible to get out, and it requires hours upon hours of sanding. I probably spent 3 hours sanding this guitar down to get to bare wood, and I posted a video for you guys. If you're thinking about doing a Paul Reed Smith restore, don't, because it is going to be a ton of sanding. The one thing I was really surprised with is that the color on the 2K was the last finish that they put on. They didn't put a protective coat over the color. So if you chip out anything, you have to sort of match the color perfectly going back in. What I've done when I do a color is I put a color coat on and then I put another coat on top of that. And for some reason, when I was pulling the color off this guitar, it didn't look like they put like a sealer coat on with the color, which I didn't really understand at all. So we've got the heat gun and a scraper, and I'm trying to scrape off as much of this as I can. I thought I could try a stripper, and once I pulled off that 2K on the top, I put the stripper on, and I was hoping that I could just sort of get it to chemically peel off, and that wasn't happening at all. So once we tried to get it all off with a chemical stripper, we went back and pulled out 80 grit on my Craftsman orbiting sander, and you can see that sealer is still white. I'm still sanding white. I'm really not getting to the wood at all. And as I'm going through this, I eventually start pulling it off. I'm just incredibly disappointed in getting this done. So I end up starting to sand a ton of the top off to get this epoxy sealer. There's a name for it. I was looking it up. I'll have to find it. I'll post that in the comments below. But this stuff is brutal. And this being a really nice carved top, I have to take a lot of it off. So on the back side here, for some reason it didn't sit as well. So once I pulled off the sander, I was immediately able to sand more of that sealer off. I think it's because it's a mahogany back versus a maple top. So maple being harder than mahogany, I thought that would work better. My genius idea was to get the power carver out and try and recarve it, which I was stupid, so stopped that relatively quickly. So there's a little bit of finish left on the sides, and we'll go ahead and scrape that off on the sides as well. The one thing I did learn from doing this was just to leave the finish on the neck, and I'm going to respray the neck. So I'm going to sand it here in a little bit with 320, and I'm just going to put a opaque color on the back and that way I won't have to really do all the work on the back side of this. So got a ton of different tools here to try and get this clean. I've even got a 2-inch air-powered sander, and that didn't help. What it did do, though, was sort of clean up that edge where all the chips and chunks were out. And I got that at least flat. I can sand the sides a little bit easier with that 2-inch air sander. So I knew I wasn't going to get all the sealer off, but that 2-inch sander really helped in the nooks and crannies. And you can see I go from daytime to nighttime here working on this. My frustration was that I had about 4 hours doing this in total of getting this body clean, and it's just sanding and sanding and sanding. And right now I've got it sanded to 220. I've got to get this yet down to 320. That little horn was a real pain, so I pulled out some of my carving tools to get that horn clean. These are those Japanese files that worked really well. It's got a couple different blocks. And just trying to get the horns clean. I was going to leave them, but I really want a clean top for the stain that I'll do. I've already got a stain in my head of what I want to do this in. So a little bit more 2K finish left on the inside of the horn. So doing this relatively carefully, trying not to ding the neck at all. Ton of hand sanding here. Again, I caution you, if you think you're going to be able to refinish a Paul Reed Smith project, it's not happening. It's going to take a ton of work. I'll definitely take on another Les Paul project with nitro, but I will not do a Paul Reed Smith project. So this is where I actually learned to not refinish the neck, just sand what I've got on there down with 320, get it ready for an opaque color. We're going to bring some water in here now and get the maple to raise its grain, make sure I've got any of that sealer out. So I want to see what I've got left, clean off the body a little bit, see what needs a little bit more TLC. And those control cavities, those rounded control cavities need a little bit more work. And so I've got this ball sander, and just going back and forth, I actually got them clean and rounded them out, which was definitely needed after sanding as much of the top out as I did. So we'll then use this ball sander on the horns as well. This worked out really well. That ball sander has actually been one of the better tools I've found. So I had to order some aluminum sanding beams. So I found a guy in South Korea that was selling these. I bought 2 different sizes. You can see them on eBay. I'll put the link below. And this is a 9.5 radius fretboard. And we'll start with some 80 grit. And we'll sand this all the way down to 320. 80 grit was to get some of the epoxy out of the frets. And we'll use the large sanding beam to get an overall radius. Once I've got it cleaned up, I'll come back with a .022 fret saw and clean out the frets. We're going to be putting stainless steel frets back into the sucker. So that's one of the things that is not on a Paul Reed Smith. Usually require a decent amount of work, but I've found some really good frets from Philadelphia Luthier Supplies that we'll be putting on. I was going to save the headstock, but I found a guy online who had a PRS logo that I'll re-put back on here. And then I'm going to leave the very top of the back of the headstock clear, so that way I can, tape off that serial number. Make sure I keep that serial number. So like I said, I didn't refinish the whole neck. I am just sanding it down to 320 and getting it prepped for that opaque color. So I've still got to sand the body down to 320, but I'll be getting ready for a stain and a finish. So that's part 1 of my Paul Reed Smith project, guys. Thanks for watching. We will see you in the next video.